everybody who's watching this video. My name is Claire Cummings, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Centre for Digital Assets and Democracy. And I'm recording this video together with Kevin Dowd, who I'll introduce fully in a second, as part of an event that we're holding together with Bitcoin Policy UK, where we ask the question whether CBDCs are, in fact, a silent threat to democracy. Now, Kevin is the Professor of Finance and Economics at Durham University Business School. He's the author of many books and papers and has spent a lot of his professional time looking at CBDCs and how they work or how they don't work. So, Kevin, I think it's fair enough to say that you are one of the world's experts in CBDCs. So could I ask you to kick off with probably quite a simple question? What is a CBDC? And then could I ask, what is the hole that a CBDC is meant to plug?
Okay, so a digital currency is essentially an item on a digital ledger. It's a currency that exists not in physical form, but on a digital ledger. And a CBDC is a digital currency that's issued by a central bank, as opposed to a digital currency that's issued by a private money issuer, like a bank.
Yeah, so it's state issued rather than commercially issued. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And why are so many countries talking about issuing CBDCs and have so many already issued them? What's the hole they're meant to plug?
Well, there isn't a hole. The problem is a CBDC is a solution in search of a problem. So I would say there is no hole to plug, first point. But your first question was, why are they so topical among central banks? And I think it's a kind of mania that's taken hold among central banks in response to cryptocurrencies, and especially Libra, the cryptocurrency it was the digital currency that Libra, that Meta offered. Frightened the hell out of central bankers, and also gave them an excuse to push an agenda, essentially a control agenda, in response to the threat of cryptos.
Yeah. Well, if we could talk about the control issue a moment, because to me that's particularly interesting. One of the reasons that the Centre for Digital Assets and Democracy exists is to try and make people, in particular politicians, much more aware of what we consider a basic democratic concept, that politicians are servants of the people. It's not the other way around. And when you think about the way that the state or its agencies, for example, the Bank of England, are able to see what we're up to, I think we start to move in quite a chilling direction with CBDCs. This is against the backdrop of the government already being able to see quite a lot of what we do. So, for example, if I could just quote Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation, and thank you, Kevin, because I took this quote directly from your most recent paper. He says, today, governments and corporates can understand the language of global payments. Within moments of buying something online with a tap or a swipe, your identity is revealed to authorities and data markets that share and trade your personal information. So here's a question. If that's already possible, what's the big fuss about CBDCs? Now,
the first thing is, well,
after you, sorry.
I'm sorry, sorry, Claire, I was about to say, there's an issue of financial privacy, which itself is an aspect of privacy. This is a fundamental principle that, for example, in the 19th century was held to be sacrosanct. And we don't just toss it away as if it's of no account. We know that the technology exists to invade privacy. The question is, should we allow it?
Yeah.
And I think we have to have a debate on those lines.
should we allow it? And yeah, and if we say that we shouldn't, or we shouldn't, and or we shouldn't without certain checks and balances. For example, the separation of powers is a wonderful concept.
Yes,
it's got to work
of
in
course.
practice, though, isn't it? Should the Bank of England or should the police be able to see what we're doing? Well, I guess if a judge says yes, you've built in that check to the system, but otherwise no. And my argument to this would be, just because this is already possible, it doesn't mean to say that more should be introduced. In fact, I would argue that the Bank of England and other state agencies who have this ability to see into our private lives shouldn't be working on increasing this ability. They should be working on decreasing.
Yes, I mean, the 19th century notion of privacy, I think, was well defined, and it had an exception, which was most important, that if you had a criminal investigation, the investigating authorities could actually invade your financial privacy or your privacy generally, but they had to have a court order from a judge, and they had to go through that effort and present probable cause or something similar. The judge would issue a search warrant.
Yeah.
And away you go. That is the system that we had, the system that we should have. It protects privacy, subject to the investigation by criminal authorities in pursuit of a clear crime.
Yeah. Which I think brings us nicely on to what is possibly one of the most infamous countries to have brought in a CBDC, and that is the wholly undemocratic People's Republic of China. Now, here's my view again. If China's doing something, it's probably a good reason for us to stop and think about not doing it in the first place.
I agree. I mean, I'm not going to argue with that at all, because I agree with you 100%.
Could you tell us a bit more about the Chinese system of CBDCs? Because they've been, perhaps the word sophisticated isn't quite right, but the Chinese state has definitely made use of the information it's gained, and it uses CBDCs in a number of ways. So would you perhaps be able to give us an overview of that? Bearing in mind the consideration of the silent threat to democracy, whether this is a fair question to ask or not.
Okay, so China has a very sophisticated digital economy. It has its payment providers, its digital payment providers are very sophisticated and provide everything that the public actually need. There is no need for the People's Bank of China to come in and issue its own CBDC. People already have the same.
Yeah, so much as the central, as much as the Bank of England here, they can see everything already. Yeah. There are similarities, if not equivalents.
Well, I wouldn't say direct. They're not exactly the same, but because the Bank of England doesn't yet have a CBDC, a Bitcoin, whereas the People's Bank of China does.
Yeah.
But also you have to see the EU1 in the context of the Chinese social credit system, which is essentially about ensuring overall control by the Communist Party over every aspect of people's lives. So the CBDC in China is part of that system. So number one, it's unnecessary. Number two, it's grossly immoral. And number three, it's part of a control system. So who wants a control system? Of course, we don't in this country. We shouldn't. And so those to me are ample reasons to reject it entirely.
Kevin, could you tell us what the take-up has been within the general population in countries where CBDCs have been introduced?
Okay, so the take-up among the general population is so minuscule, you'd never even notice it. In China, I did some calculations, and they're about 12 US cents. That's nothing. Yeah. I mean, it's homeopathic nothing. it's tiny.
Yeah.
And yet
Particularly
there's an
compared to all the
enormous
effort
amount
that's,
of energy. Well, the point is that there's an enormous amount of regulatory effort to produce such a tiny result. That tells you that the regulatory effort is motivated by something else other than, pure, let's have an efficient digital economy type of consideration. It's motivated by a control agenda, and they're reluctant in general to admit it. And that goes for all the countries which have implemented CBDCs. The take-up has been enormous. You see, you can issue a CBDC, but you can't make people want to hold it.
yeah.
That's the fundamental problem. And people do not want to hold it.
And you've also got to make sure that it runs properly, that it can be used commercially, and that it's wholly reliable. I think there are a couple of events in Ecuador and Nigeria that proved problematic. Could you tell us a bit about what happened in those countries with their CBDCs?
So Ecuador introduced, you might say, the first modern CBDC in 2014. And there was a big fanfare about it at the time. All the usual, you can imagine it. 3 years later, it was abandoned. And the reason it didn't work is because people didn't trust the central bank. They didn't trust the government. They did trust private currencies, so they used them instead. And I mean, my favorite anecdote about that is that they couldn't even cover their costs of production. So the profits generated to the government or to the central bank, the profits couldn't cover more than a fraction of the costs. So they couldn't even make money issuing their own money, and they didn't even have to print the money. They still couldn't make
money system. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a country that isn't exactly sort of leading the way in welfare state and provision of resources for those in need as well. Yeah.
So
and Nigeria?
Well, Nigeria was
how did that one play out?
Well, Nigeria was a disaster. They introduced the CBDC. Bear in mind, quite two things about Nigeria. It's a very unusual economy because half of the economy is very agrarian and cash dependent, and a substantial part of the economy is exceptionally sophisticated.
Yeah.
In terms of cryptocurrencies and so forth. It was almost the last place that you would introduce a CBDC, but they did. And, take-up was very low. It was widely mocked. And people resorted to crypto especially, or to or any number of alternatives to the CBDC. The central bank's response to that was to start a war on cash. They wanted to effectively eliminate cash entirely. Bear in mind that the good half of the economy is agrarian and cash dependent.
Cash-based.
Didn't matter. This led to enormous public outrage, and the net result was the government backed down, and the central bank governor was arrested and is now in jail. So it was quite serious, but it was the casual way in which they introduced the policy and then decided to get rid of cash while we're at it. That was appalling. I mean, you talk about giving people too much power. This is a classic example.
Yeah, and I believe as well that, and I understand that the East Caribbean Union and Nigeria have something in common with their respective CBDCs. I was at the Human Rights Foundation event in Oslo in May, and a lady from Nigeria was talking about the number of times that the system behind the Nigerian CBDC went down, so it was unusable. And I believe the same thing happened with the Caribbean, didn't it?
Yes, it did. In the East Caribbean Currency Union, the Dcash CBDC was launched to big fanfare, and within a relatively short time, it was offline. And now this is a catastrophe. If it's offline for a day, You can imagine if the CBDC was widely used and suddenly you couldn't use it, but this was offline for over a month. And it turned out to be something called an expired certificate, which apparently is a fairly straightforward problem to resolve.
I've had that on my laptop at times. Yeah.
It was a hyperledger something or other.
So can I just take from our discussion that you're fully in favour of cash in society, and you would consider that CBDCs have the potential, at least, to be a silent threat to our democracy?
Well, I would say they're more than a silent threat. I'm totally opposed to them, and I would emphasize again that they're completely unnecessary. You could simply, the central bank, if it wishes to have a role in this space, merely needs to set rules for the private sector to jump in and offer digital currencies. And those would be more than adequate to what we need. And this is an irony that that's exactly what you have in China. China has the most sophisticated digital payment system, and it's almost like a free banking system where the role of the central bank is minimal, would you believe? That's because of the sophistication of the private sector in China. But in principle, the same applies everywhere else. CBDCs
private sector with the correct.
Yeah, you want the right legal framework.
The correct regulation in place and correctly applied as well.
Yes, and the correct regulation is a liberal one, is that allows, it does not impose barriers against legitimate trade. So the idea is
everything that isn't explicitly illegal.
Yeah, so what you want is something that allows people to do reasonable things together rather than prohibits them from doing that. They're communists, what do you expect?
Yeah. Kevin, I think that last sentence is the perfect one to sum things up and for us to end on. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Claire.